Far-right groups gathered in Portland, Oregon over the weekend to commemorate a violent clash last summer in the city during an event they called, quote, the Summer of Love. The groups were met with anti-fascist and far-left demonstrators in opposition of the gathering. Video posted online shows the clashes between the Proud Boys and Antifa, with chemical spray being deployed on both sides. Journalist Zaid Jilani weighed in on the events, highlighting the fact that the face-off between the extremists in Portland received no state intervention. He joins us now to discuss. Welcome, Zaid. Fill us in, what was happening? I haven't seen much coverage of this in mainstream media, but a ton on social media.
Yeah, so I would say that every few months there's a group of folks, they call themselves the Proud Boys. I think a lot of people know who they are following January 6th, where there were a number of those people involved with that. Basically, it's like a right-wing kind of Western or male chauvinist group. Sometimes they get called white nationalists, but they're not actually. I don't think they're not actually white nationalists. In fact, the leader, who was just arrested, is like Afro-Cuban or something. But basically, these guys roll into Portland every few months, and they're kind of looking for a fight. If you want a really good report about this, there was one by Nancy Rollman at Reason in 2019 about a fight between Proud Boys and Antifa in August of that year. And basically, they have a series of like gladiatorial style clashes where they're using like low levels of violence, meaning, you know, they might have sticks and shields, and they throw things at each other. There's usually not any kind of lethal violence like you would expect with guns and things like that. They're not like gangs in American cities. They're both kind of expecting to walk away alive. But they have these clashes, and what's really interesting is that both sides kind of say they're protecting the city from each other, but they're only really interested in fighting each other. Like, if only one side showed up, there probably wouldn't be any kind of clashes. They just kind of be bored and mill around it and go home. Although they do both kind of hate the police and like don't get along very well with the police, which is part of the reason why I think that police kind of let them fight with each other, because they kind of don't want to put up with the trouble, because it's been happening for so long within Portland. And there's also the reality that I think that when you arrest people in Portland for these sorts of things, a lot of times the charges don't really stick. The DA kind of like goes easy on them, except in the more extreme cases like extreme violence. So I don't know that the police themselves feel super motivated to go and police fights between people who hate them and who they really can't keep behind bars for very long. And, you know, the other thing that's happening is that in Portland, they've had one of the worst sprees of murders in their history, I think. They're up to like 61 murders this year. And I don't know that police want to deploy a lot of resources to deal with what are like glorified LARPers in their city. That being said, I think in most places in America, if this was regularly happening, people would be upset. They'd probably want the police to go and intervene and arrest people. And that's kind of my joke, is that, you know, this has kind of become almost a feature of Portland's social fabric, is to have people, far left and far right people, kind of battling each other in kind of low-grade violence. My suggestion would be that these people, you know, start a fight club or have some kind of formal boxing match and sell tickets and fund some charity that both sides agree on. Like, they could do something productive with it. But yeah, unfortunately, this has become like a weird quirk of Portland's culture now, is that they have these kind of street clashes between political factions on the extremes. And this was, I think, last weekend or this past week was another example of that.
So you want to legalize and regulate the battling back and forth?
I don't know if you guys saw the movie Pig with Nicolas Cage. It's a really good movie, actually. Like, people don't realize how good Cage is of an actor. But that movie is actually set in Portland. And in that movie, they do actually have a fight club, like an underground fight club in Portland. It doesn't have Antifa or Proud Boy people in it. But I'm kind of wondering if the director was making a subtle nod to all this. Because there is, I think, you know, one thing Nancy makes clear in her writing is that it's largely like young people who are a little bit adrift. Like, she said she didn't really meet people that were like older than their 20s when she was reporting with Antifa and talking to Proud Boys. I'm sure there are a few older people in that, but I think it's a country across country, culture across culture. You tend to have young people who kind of go adrift, and they find their meaning in some sort of political cause or social club or clique. And I think that's what a lot of this is. I think people who would look at this and think, oh, it's a civil war, or it's terrorism, or there's going to be some big fight, or there's going to be some like bloody violence. I don't really think any of that's going to happen. I really do think it is. It's not that dissimilar from like, you know, cliques of young kids fighting each other in any other city or place in the world. But it does have a little bit of, I think, political cloth to it. because of the way they organize themselves in these groups. But for the most part, I don't think it's something that's going to super disturb or unsettle the city compared to what's happening with the murders, which they really need to get under control. But it is unfortunate, I think, that they are doing this in public, and they're doing it in streets. And I think people who live in those areas, and businesses in those areas, don't like it. And occasionally it does escalate to actual lethal violence. There was somebody killed last year. There was an Antifa guy who shot, I think, some right-wing guy, and then later that guy was killed by police under circumstances that were a little bit sketchy, and there wasn't any video or anything. So, yeah, unfortunately, it does escalate like that sometimes, but it's largely low-grade violence that's just really disruptive.
Well, and I remember last summer when these clashes were taking place, some of the critiques coming from the cable news world that was covering it at the time was defacing public property and harming businesses in the area. And there were some examples. I believe there was a federal courthouse that was torched in the, back and forth of these fights. But what you're describing sounds like maybe a much more kind of almost like cosplay version of actual violence and something not quite as concerning. That's your read?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of different things going on. So the Proud Boys, they go into Portland every few months from what I've heard and what I've read, meaning that they're not necessarily there on the scene all the time, but Antifa needs its own kind of group cohesion, right? And they need a cause. And that cause has largely been anti-police protests and in some cases riots, including trying to burn down a federal courthouse literally probably 100 times or something like that. They had hundreds of days of action in 2020. It was largely it was similar to this. It was low-grade violence with some arson and stuff like that. They don't ever bring guns or bombs or anything like that, but they do. They yell obscenities at police officers. They rough people up and they get arrested, and the DA largely lets them go. So it's rinse and repeat. I don't think they would tolerate something like this in Birmingham or Atlanta or Memphis or Nashville, but it's kind of a quirk of Portland's politics, in that I think that most people who live in Portland don't ever experience all this, because this all takes place in downtown in a few city blocks. I talk to people who live there and say, yeah, we've never even seen any of this. But if you happen to be in those areas, which I think a lot of businesses are, and a lot of people who are government employees who work at that federal courthouse or who are in the police, I think they do get really annoyed by it and really angry about it. And one thing I've noticed is that Portland is trying to staff up a gun violence team with their police right now because of the rash of shootings, and they're having a hard time finding people who actually want to join the Portland police. I mean, why would you? You could go work in one of the suburbs for decent pay, and people aren't yelling things at you and throwing things at you. So it kind of makes sense. So it does cause a problem, although I don't think it's as severe as, I made a joke about Afghanistan, but it's not actually Afghanistan. It is, a lot of it is LARPing. So.
Well, I'm just curious because, we hear all the time that Antifa is not an organized group, but it sounds like in this particular situation they are.
Yeah, I think when there was the testimony, when FBI and DHS talk about this, what they're saying when they say, and Biden even said this, that when they say Antifa is an idea, what they mean is that it's an idea that groups of people glom around. So I think in Portland, it's actually a set of people, usually the same people, who are usually involved in organized groups, and they call themselves anti-fascist or similar organizations. So yeah, in that sense, they have an organization. But I think when the government's saying it's an idea, not an organization, what they're saying is it's a set of ideas that motivate people, sometimes as individuals, sometimes as groups, sometimes just online memes and stuff like that. But they weren't saying that there aren't actual people. It's just you couldn't go arrest them all on RICO or anything, because it's not like a gang or like the mafia. It's not that well organized across the United States. But it is an idea that people end up organizing around based on their local context. So I think that's kind of what they were trying to say. I know people were making fun of it a lot, but actually what they were saying was reasonable if you saw it in the context. But
And I think that I saw a report that after a Proud Boy fired into a crowd of the crowd there, that somebody from Antifa was armed and fired back. So, I mean, once in a while, I think, and because you're going to have disparate groups and you don't know who's showing up to these events, sometimes they are showing up armed with actual firearms. But I think you're right that's not prevalent. Usually it's, the sticks and the bats and the chains and the mace and, the shields and the typical accoutrements that we see in these protests. But Zaid, thank you so much for joining us.
Yep, thanks.
We'll have more Rising for you right after this.